Fighters come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. There are huge, hulking giants. There are small, quick, and agile technicians. There are super jacked wrestlers and long, lanky kickboxers. But what are the best physical traits a fighter could have? What are the attributes that, if a fighter has them, grants him a noticeable advantage over his opponents? Well, today, I've compiled a list of physical traits that I believe are the best ones a fighter could have. And when I picked these traits, I did so while considering how good they are pound for pound, since if we were just going based on what would be the best physical attributes for winning a fight, you'd obviously just choose to be as big as possible. The physical attributes I'll be talking about today apply to every weight class in fighting, and if you're a fighter or an aspiring fighter with one or more of these traits, I think you can consider yourself quite lucky. So, without further ado, let's get started. Long arms. So long arms are one of the most commonly discussed physical advantages you can have for fighting. And this trait is so commonly discussed that it is included in the tail of the tape for all fights. Having long arms is advantageous for a variety of reasons. The most common and obvious upside of long arms is that a fighter will have a longer range on his punches, and particularly straight shots like the jab and rear hand straight. The best example of a fighter with long arms utilizing his range to outbox his opponent is Alexander Volkanovski in his third fight with Max Holloway. Alexander Volkanovski, who is 5'6", or 168 centimeters tall, is widely known for having a disproportionately long reach for his height. Volkanovski has a reach of 71.5 inches, or 180 centimeters. The ratio of a man's height to his arm span, colloquially known as his ape index, is typically 1:1, so Volkanovski's reach is 12 centimeters longer than should be expected for his height. And everybody's favorite 210-pound rugby player turned featherweight GOAT utilized that advantage to perfection against Max Holloway. As you can see here, at 1 minute and 9 seconds remaining in the second round, Volkanovski jabs at Holloway, grazing him. But when Holloway counters back with a right straight, Volkanovski can just lean out of the way of Holloway's strike, and then fire back another jab. Volkanovski does this again at 15 seconds remaining in the round, where he jabs and then sways out of the way of Max's counter left hook. However, the jab isn't the only way Volkanovski utilized his reach advantage against Max Holloway. One of the key techniques Volkanovski used against Max Holloway, who is much taller than him but has a negative ape index, was controlling Max's rear hand with his own lead hand. By reaching out and obstructing Max's rear hand, Volkanovski was able to not only limit Max's ability to fire the right hand, but land his own shots by swatting at Max's guard and then landing a short jab between the gaps. These shots aren't KO blows, of course, but they score points, disrupt rhythm, and contribute to facial damage like bruising and cuts. The final major way that Volkanovski utilized his reach advantage against Max Holloway was landing the right cross over Max's lead hand. The cross in boxing is called the cross because it crosses the opponent's lead hand, traveling over their jab or guard to reach their head. And of course, this shot is going to be both easier to land and more powerful if you have a long reach, as you'll be able to extend your arm further. However, offense and counters aren't the only way that long arms help fighters with their striking. And that's because having long arms is one of the best defensive tools a fighter can have. When a fighter with long arms shells up, he'll be able to cover more vulnerable areas than a fighter with short arms. And this is best demonstrated by Ilia Topuria, who, while not having the absolute gorilla arms that Alexander Volkanovski does, still has a positive ape index. And to give credit where credit is due, it was MMA Che, a much more famous and handsome MMA YouTuber than myself, who pointed this out to me. As Rabbi Shea so often points out whenever he's discussing Ilia Topuria, Topuria is able to defend both body and head kicks with his defensive shell, while a fighter with shorter arms wouldn't be able to defend all of those shots. I'll add here that this also applies to boxing in the pocket as well, since shelling up as a fighter with longer arms will defend against punches to both the head and the body. Now, while I've been talking about the advantages of a wide wingspan for striking so far, there are many upsides to long arms for grapplers as well. Notably, they help with securing key submissions like the Darce and Anaconda choke, especially from the front headlock position. An example of a fighter who was very good at utilizing his reach to secure such chokes was prime Tony Ferguson. Tony stands 5'11", or 180 centimeters tall, which is the same as Max Holloway, but Tony has a reach of 76.5 inches, or 193 centimeters, which is 18 centimeters longer than Max. When Tony Ferguson went on his legendary 12-fight win streak in the lightweight division, he secured 3 of those wins with a Darce choke. Another fighter with a long reach who specializes in such chokes is Charles Oliveira, who has 7 wins in the UFC by guillotine, Darce, anaconda, and the Peruvian necktie choke. The front headlock is an incredibly common position in MMA, since it's where you're going to end up whenever you sprawl against a takedown attempt. So having long arms and a good Darce or anaconda choke to capitalize on a failed takedown attempt is a great threat to have. And since many fighters are trained to shoot on their opponent if they're hurt, these chokes are some of the most effective ways to finish an opponent, which should go without saying since the greatest finisher in UFC history, Charles Oliveira, is a master of them. However, cool finishes aren't the only way that long arms help a fighter with their grappling. As a final note on this particular attribute, I'd like to bring up one of the most underrated advantages of having long arms as a fighter, which is how they help with securing one of the most reliable takedowns in MMA, the lock hands double at the fence. The lock hands double leg is a very simple takedown. You lock your hands behind your opponent's hips and yank their legs out from beneath them. And if you have longer arms, this becomes much easier to do, since even if your opponent spreads their legs to defend, you're still going to be able to lock your hands. Georges St-Pierre, the greatest fighter of all time, fuck you John Jones, was a master of this takedown. GSP has a reach that is 15 centimeters longer than his height. And even though St-Pierre had no grappling background, he used the lock hands double leg to secure takedowns against BJ Penn, a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu prodigy, and Josh Koscheck, an NCAA Division I All-American wrestler. So, those are the reasons why arm reach is on the tail of the tape for every single fight, and that's because it can provide all of these noticeable advantages. Big hands. Ever heard someone say, well, that fighter has heavy hands, to describe a power puncher? Well, literally having heavy hands will help with knockout power. And a great example of a fighter with those hands is none other than a man with hands of stone, Alex Poatan Pereira. Alex Pereira is known for having one of the most devastating left hooks in combat sports history, and one of the reasons why he slumps so many opponents with that weapon is because of just how huge his hands are. Punching power doesn't come from nowhere. We're all bound by the laws of physics, and as Isaac Newton once made clear, force equals mass times acceleration. The greater the mass of your fist, the more force will be exerted on your opponent's chin upon impact. Besides Pereira, another power puncher with huge hands is Shane Carwin, a heavy hitter who had a 100% finish rate during his MMA career. Carwin needed to wear huge gloves in the octagon, and here he is making Brock Lesnar's hands look small. And if we take a quick detour into the world of boxing, the all-time great boxer Manny Pacquiao is known for having wrists that are disproportionately large for his small height. But punching power isn't the only thing that big hands help with. Big hands help with securing and maintaining grips due to their greater surface area, which is useful for grappling. As we can see from the world of professional arm wrestling, having large hands helps with fighting against another man's grip. If you watch Alex Pereira's fight with Jan Blachowicz, where he got his back taken in the first round and got taken down multiple times throughout the fight, you'll see how good Pereira's hand fighting was despite being quite new to grappling. Pereira, who spent most of his combat sports career as a kickboxer, successfully defended himself from chokes and ground and pound by controlling Jan's wrists. And of course, being able to secure wrist control against opponents is a big help to your offense as well, since controlling wrists is vital to many core submissions like the rear naked choke and triangle armbar from guard. And as a final note on this particular trait, having denser bones making up your hands is going to lead to fewer injuries. Hand injuries are one of the most common injuries for fighters, as fists are made up of many small and relatively fragile bones. You know, there's a reason why the break of the fifth metacarpal bone near the knuckle of the pinky finger is called the boxer's fracture. Having stronger bones that are covered with more muscle and thicker tendons is going to lead to fewer injuries, which is a significant upside. Muscularity. Now, I know that by bringing this up, I've probably got half of you watching saying,
excuse me, but muscles don't win fights. Just look at Sugar Sean O'Malley and Stylebender.
and the other half of you are saying, duh, of course, man, being jacked and 260 pounds will let you slam Demetrius Johnson onto the concrete. And look, if we're talking about two guys of equal height and more or less equal skill, but one guy is a skinny 135 pounds and the other guy is 170 pounds of muscle, you'd be stupid not to pick the guy who is jacked. You see what I did there? Jacked? Jack de la Maddalena? Never mind, okay. But we're talking about muscularity in a pound-for-pound context. So, why do I say that being more swole at a weight class is better, even if you give up a couple inches in height to your opponents? Well, it comes down to this. Weight cutting. In all combat sports, fighters drain their bodies of water, sodium, and carbohydrates during their fight week in a grueling weight cut. They then weigh in at their contracted fight weight around 24 hours to 36 hours before the fight, and then rehydrate and replenish their bodies. Most top fighters regain 20 to 30 pounds or 9 to 13 kilograms between weigh-ins and fight day. As a fighter, having more of your body made up of muscle helps with this process, and that's because of how muscles work. Muscle tissue is 79% water, meaning that even if a fighter puts on muscle, they can squeeze water out of that muscle through their weight cut, and then regain that water weight while recovering. Muscles also store carbohydrates in the form of glycogen, which can be depleted during the weight cut and then replenished within 24 to 48 hours. This means that a fighter with more muscle is going to be able to have a higher walk-around weight and a higher weight on fight day than a fighter who is skinnier and taller for the weight class, since a greater proportion of the lankier fighter's body mass will be made up of bone and organ weight. And if you want proof that being jacked for your weight class is better than being tall for your weight class, just take a look at who is champion in every single UFC weight class right now. Pantoja, Merab, and Volkanovski are all on the short side for their weight classes. The same applies to Ilia Topuria for both featherweight and lightweight. Islam and Jack Della Maddalena are both around average height, or slightly below that for lightweight and welterweight respectively. Dricus du Plessis is 1 inch shorter than the middleweight average and absolutely jacked. And while Ankalaev isn't super swole, he does seem to have more muscle than Pereira from the looks of it. And with heavyweight, well, heavyweight really doesn't count because heavyweights don't do a weight cut, but Tom Aspinall, he's also super jacked as well. And if you look at Volkanovski, Merab, and Ilia, they always look like complete death on the scales. But on fight day, after they've recovered over 20 pounds, they go on to dominate their taller, lankier opponents. But yes, besides this advantage that having more muscle gives in weight cutting and recovery, there's other obvious advantages to having more muscle, such as greater strength, greater power, and greater durability as well. And there's one particular muscle that, when it's large and well developed, is so advantageous that I had to put it in an entire separate category of its own. Big shoulders. Throughout combat sports history, there have been many fighters who have been described as having bolder shoulders, and it's no wonder that fighters build such large shoulders. The muscles that are engaged most regularly when punching are the deltoids. The shoulders are also a primary mover or a key supporting muscle in a variety of pressing movements, like push-ups, dips, bench press, and the clean and press, which are all very common conditioning exercises for fighters. And to explain all the benefits of having big, juicy, thick shoulders as an MMA fighter, allow me to bring up who I think best utilizes this particular physical attribute in the UFC today, and that is middleweight champion Dricus du Plessis. Now, I know that Dricus gets a lot of shit for looking like a cartoon gorilla on roller skates when he fights, but there is a method to his madness, and a noticeable part of that stems from the sheer size of those Death Star delts. When Dricus fights, you'll see him using this high guard quite often to defend punches. However, if you've ever trained in mixed martial arts, you know that using a typical high guard from boxing or kickboxing doesn't work well in MMA because of how much smaller the gloves are. Smaller gloves cover less surface area, meaning a skilled fighter can thread power shots in between the gaps in the guard. However, this doesn't happen often with Dricus, which I largely attribute to the size of his shoulders. When Dricus shells up, his shoulders serve as big, meaty shields that guard his chin against hooks, allowing him to place his hands quite high up, which then helps guard his temple. This makes it so that Dricus is only really susceptible to being jabbed, as we saw in the first Strickland fight. But even there, we saw him make significant improvements in the rematch. And speaking of jabs, the other advantage of Dricus' huge shoulders is how they make even his weakest punches very powerful. This is most evident in his fight with Robert Whittaker, where he dropped the Reaper with a southpaw jab, which led to a finish. And now, a bunch of you might start saying, oh, Whitaker's chinny, and all of that, but in his fight after losing to DDP, Robert survived a flush spinning heel kick from Paulo Costa. Having a powerful jab is good in any striking sport, but it's especially great in MMA because it is much easier to hurt or even KO your opponent with a jab due to the smaller gloves. Long legs. Having long legs for their height gives fighters a number of advantages. First, longer legs gives not only greater range on all kicks, but more leverage on them as well, resulting in greater power. An example of a fighter with long legs and crazy power in his kicks is Marlon Vera, who has a leg reach of 103 centimeters while standing only 173 centimeters tall. This gives Vera a greater leg reach than Stipe Miocic, a heavyweight. As we all know, Vera's kicks are his deadliest weapons, KOing Dominic Cruz and Frankie Edgar with head kicks and deadening the nerve in O'Malley's leg with a low kick. And considering how successful Marlon Vera has been in the division as skilled as bantamweight without being particularly skilled himself, I think the power in his kicks was a significant contributing factor. Other fighters with long leg reach include Israel Adesanya and John Jones, who use their length to outpoint their opponents with low kicks and oblique kicks from range. Another advantage of long legs is how they help with securing submissions in dominant positions in jiu-jitsu, notably the triangle choke and the body triangle. For anybody who has ever done jiu-jitsu, you would know that securing triangle chokes is quite hard if you have thick, stubby legs as opposed to long ones. And if your legs are too short, you will have a harder time getting your hooks in against a taller opponent. And while having longer legs will mean that a fighter has a higher center of gravity, making him susceptible to takedowns like the blast double leg, long legs can help a lot with wrestling defense as well. First off, a fighter having significantly longer legs than his opponent can render him essentially immune to certain takedowns, notably the treetop finish to the single leg. Having longer legs also helps a fighter when they're up against the fence and defending a takedown there, as they can get a wider base when spreading their legs open. And now, I've saved what I think is the most controversial physical advantage for last. And here it is. Darker skin. So, to be completely clear, I'm not trying to be racist here. I don't think darker skin, or the lack thereof, actually impacts your fighting ability. However, I do think that having darker skin can be advantageous when it comes to how a fight is scored. And to help explain what I mean, here's Sean Strickland talking about the subject after he lost a close split decision to Jared Cannonier.
I thought I was next in line. I thought I got robbed with Cannonier.
You thought you won the fight?
Yes. I've had some people in the UFC come and be like, oh man, you got robbed. It was kind of funny. And one of those things where they're like, well, Sean, you showed damage. I had a scratch on my nose. I'm like, guys, I'm white. Cold weather damages me. You get some wind and I get damage. You get some cold air and I get chapped lips and I start bleeding. A scratch on the nose doesn't lose a fight.
So you thought you should have won that fight and was the rightful #1 contender?
Yes, 100%.
Scoring in mixed martial arts is done based on damage, and a lot of the time, that comes down to who is more visibly damaged by shots. Judges look at cuts, black eyes, swelling, redness, and other signs of visible damage to determine who is winning. So this is the photo of Sean Strickland from the fight he had with Cannonier that could have gone either way. Although there's not a lot of damage, the cut is very, very visible. And now compare that to Israel Adesanya in this photo here. This is him right after he got beat up by Sean Strickland over the course of 5 rounds. He looks pretty alright, doesn't he? But when Adesanya released a video of himself after the fight, it turned out that he had a black eye and some significant bruising on his face. And while Adesanya lost that fight pretty clearly, and there were no judging shenanigans there, you can probably understand how having a darker skin tone can make damage harder to see for the judges, which could be a deciding factor in some very close fights. So, while having darker skin isn't an advantage when it comes to actual fighting, it could be beneficial if the fight goes to the scorecards. Which means, yeah, if you're a fighter with a pale complexion, you might want to consider getting a tan or some tattoos to try and get the judges on your side. Anyways, ending on that slightly, possibly controversial note, that's the end of this video. If there's any other advantageous physical traits you think I've missed, please comment them below, and I might make a sequel to this video with them. Also, join my channel Discord through the link in the description, and follow me on X. Goodbye.